The moment Susan Lockhart realized she might actually die on the Kansas plain, a stranger on a brown horse appeared through the shimmer of heat like something conjured from a fevered dream, and what he did next would change the entire course of her life. It was the spring of 1874, and the trail from Independence, Missouri toward Dodge City, Kansas was no place for a woman traveling alone. Susan had known that before she left, had known it when she packed her single carpet bag and tied her brown hair back under a sun-bleached bonnet, and she had known it especially when the wagon she had been riding with, belonging to the Whitmore family, lost its rear axle in a creek crossing 17 miles east of the Cottonwood River. Old Gerald Whitmore had looked at her with genuine regret in his eyes when he said the wagon would take 2 full days to repair, and that he could not spare the food or the time to wait with her while she figured out her situation. She had told him she understood, which was the biggest lie she had spoken in her 24 years on Earth. The Kansas grassland stretched out in every direction like a tan and gold ocean, broken only by shallow draws and the occasional cluster of cottonwood trees near water. Susan had walked for the better part of a day and a half on her own, following the rutted trail west, before her feet began to blister through her good leather boots and her single canteen ran dry. She had rationed her food down to almost nothing, and by the morning of the second day, she had consumed the last of the hard tack she had packed in Missouri. The sun overhead was merciless. It pressed down on the flat land like a hot iron, and Susan pressed on because stopping felt like surrender, and she had not come all this way to surrender. She was walking toward Dodge City because she had a letter in her carpet bag, folded and refolded until the creases were almost worn through, from a woman named Martha Crane who ran a boarding house on Front Street. Martha had offered Susan a position as a seamstress and laundress, modest wages but room and board included. After the death of Susan's father in the winter of 1873, and the subsequent loss of their small farm outside of Leavenworth, to the creditors who had been patient up until the moment they were not, that letter represented the only solid ground left in Susan's world. She had sold everything that would sell, paid off what debts she could, and set out west with $32 sewn into the hem of her skirt and a determination that she wore like armor. But armor does not fill an empty stomach, and it does not refill a canteen. By mid-morning of the second day alone, Susan's steps had grown unsteady. The prairie rolled gently around her, and the wind pushed through the grass with a dry, papery sound that she might have found beautiful under different circumstances. She stopped at the crest of a low rise and looked west and saw nothing but more trail, more grass, and the blinding white sky. Her lips were cracked. Her throat felt like the inside of a flour sack. She sat down at the side of the trail, set her carpet bag across her knees, and for the first time since leaving Leavenworth, she pressed her face into her hands and allowed herself exactly 3 seconds of despair. That was when she heard hoofbeats. She lifted her head and shaded her eyes and watched a rider materialize from the heat shimmer to the west, coming toward her at an easy lope on a stocky bay horse. She stood up quickly, trying to look composed, trying to look like a woman who was merely resting, and not one who was quietly frightening herself with thoughts of dying of thirst in the Kansas grass. The rider slowed as he approached, and Susan kept her expression steady even as her heart hammered in her chest. A lone woman on the trail was vulnerable, and she had heard enough campfire stories from the Whitmore family to know that not every rider who stopped was stopping out of goodwill. But the man who pulled his horse to a stop a respectful distance away had eyes that were immediately, disarmingly kind. He was somewhere around 30 years old, with a broad-shouldered, rangy build that spoke of years of hard physical work. His face was tanned to a dark copper, weathered along the jaw and at the corners of his eyes, and he wore a battered brown hat with a sweat-stained band pushed back on his forehead. His dark hair curled slightly at the ends where it touched his collar. He had a thick trail coat tied to the back of his saddle and 2 canteens hanging from his saddle horn, And when he looked at Susan standing there at the side of the trail with her dried lips and her brave expression, something in his face softened. "Morning, ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat. His voice was low and unhurried, carrying a trace of somewhere south, Texas maybe, in the way the vowels rounded out. "You appear to be traveling alone." "I appear to be," Susan said, keeping her chin level. "My wagon broke down east of the Cottonwood. I have been walking toward Dodge City." The man studied the horizon to the east and then looked back at her, and she could see him calculating the distance. "That is a long walk for a person with no water," he said quietly. Susan did not bother asking how he knew. She supposed her cracked lips and the way she swallowed with difficulty answered the question plainly enough. She lifted her chin a little higher. "I have been managing." The man dismounted in a single fluid motion, dropping his reins and letting his horse stand, which it did without complaint, apparently trained to the habit. He unhooked one of the canteens from the saddle and walked toward her, holding it out with both hands in a way that somehow managed to be both an offering and a gesture of respect, not charity exactly, but something more careful than that. "Ezekiel Wells," he said, "out of the Rocking W Ranch 3 days east of Dodge. I have been to Wichita with a small herd and I am riding back." He paused. "You are welcome to water, ma'am. No condition on it." Susan looked at the canteen. She looked at him. She had been raised to be proud, and she had been raised to be cautious, and both of those impulses warred in her chest for a long moment before thirst simply defeated them both. She took the canteen and drank, carefully at first, then with more relief than she had words for, and the water was warm from the sun, but it was the most magnificent thing she had tasted in her life. She made herself stop before she had taken too much and handed it back. "Susan Lockhart," she said. "Thank you, Mr. Wells." "Ezekiel," he said, taking the canteen. Then he did something she did not expect. He reached into the saddlebag on his left side and pulled out a cloth wrapped loosely around something, and he unfolded it to reveal 2 biscuits. They were trail biscuits, the dense, slightly grayish kind cooked in a skillet over a campfire and meant to last through a long day of riding. He held one out to her. She took it, and then she saw him look briefly at the remaining biscuit and understood with a shock of clarity that this was not a man who had a full saddlebag of provisions. She had read the calculation on his face even as he kept his expression easy and unconcerned, and she understood that the second biscuit he had offered her without a moment of visible hesitation was the last one he had. The biscuit was dry and a little hard and absolutely perfect. She ate it in small bites slowly, making it last, and Ezekiel Wells leaned against his horse and looked out at the prairie with the propriety of a man giving a woman her privacy even in the open air, not watching her eat, not making her feel the weight of the gift. When she finished, she brushed the crumbs from her fingers and said, "Mr. Wells, Ezekiel, I want you to know that was the kindest thing anyone has done for me in a very long time." He turned and looked at her then, and there was something in his expression she could not fully read, a kind of quiet recognition, as if her words had landed somewhere inside him that words did not often reach. "It was a biscuit," he said simply. "It was the last one you had," she said, meeting his eyes, "and you gave it without pausing to think about it. That is not a small thing." He held her gaze for a moment and then he nodded once, accepting what she had said without deflecting it further. "Where are you headed in Dodge?" he asked, returning to practical ground. She told him about Martha Crane's boarding house and the seamstress work, and he listened without interrupting, which she appreciated. When she finished, he unhooked the second canteen and held it out to her. "I passed through Dodge before heading east," he said. "My horse can carry double for a stretch, though it is not comfortable. Or you can ride and I will walk beside. That is easier on the horse on this terrain." He paused. "Either way, I would not feel right leaving a woman alone on this trail. Not this stretch. There are men who ride through here who are not particular about minding their manners." Susan understood what he meant, and she was honest enough with herself to admit that she had been quietly afraid of exactly that for the past day and a half. She picked up her carpetbag and said, "I would be grateful for the company, Ezekiel, and I am not above admitting it." He smiled then for the first time, and it changed his entire face. The weathered lines around his eyes deepened, and something warm came into his expression, a kind of uncomplicated pleasure that had nothing calculated or performed about it. "All right, Susan Lockhart," he said. "Let us get you to Dodge City." They traveled west together through the golden morning, Ezekiel walking alongside his horse while Susan rode, which she had tried to argue against, and he had simply declined to argue about, handing her the reins with the quiet authority of a man who had already made up his mind and saw no reason to make a production of it. The horse, whose name she learned was Cartwright, was steady and good-natured and walked with the purposeful ease of an animal that had covered a great many miles. The conversation between Susan and Ezekiel grew naturally as the miles passed, the way trail talk does, beginning with practical things, the weather, the condition of the trail, the towns she had passed through, and gradually opening into something more personal and more real. She learned that Ezekiel had come to Kansas from Texas in 1869, following a cattle drive north and then staying because the country suited him. He had worked for 3 different ranches before the owner of the Rocking W, a man named Dale Hartwell, had offered him the position of foreman 2 years ago. He was 31 years old. He had no family left in Texas, his mother having died when he was 14 and his father 3 years after that, and he spoke of these losses quietly and without self-pity, the way a person speaks of things they have fully reckoned with. He had a younger brother named Thomas who had gone to California and written sporadically for a few years, and then stopped writing, and Ezekiel had accepted that too, with a kind of steady grace that Susan found both admirable and a little heartbreaking. She told him about her father and the farm and the creditors, and he listened with his eyes on the trail ahead and nodded at the right moments, and did not offer her empty comfort or tell her that it would all work out, which she appreciated far more than he could know. Empty comfort had been pressed on her in abundance since her father's death, by neighbors and church women and well-meaning relatives, and it had felt like being handed a paper cup when what you needed was a well. "You said that Biscuit was the kindest thing anyone had done for you in a long time," Ezekiel said after a while, his voice careful and not quite casual. "I take it the year has been a hard one." "The year has been a particular kind of hard," Susan said. "The kind that makes you realize that the people who say they will be there when it matters are mostly talking about the times when things are merely inconvenient, not the times when things are genuinely broken." She paused. "My father was not a wealthy man, but he was a good one, and when he died, I found out fairly quickly who in my life had been his friend and who had merely been comfortable. It is a useful lesson, though not a pleasant one." Ezekiel was quiet for a moment. "I found out something similar when I was 17, after my father died. People will surprise you both directions, mostly in the direction you don't want." He glanced up at her from under the brim of his hat, though not always. The way he said it, with his eyes on her for just a moment before returning to the trail, made something warm move through her chest. She looked at the horizon and said nothing, but she was aware of him beside her in a new way, aware of the way he moved, the particular economy of his stride, the way he would occasionally scan the surrounding countryside with the automatic vigilance of a man who had spent years reading open land for signs of trouble. By midday, they stopped at a creek to water Cartwright and rest in the shade of the cottonwoods. Ezekiel built a small fire with unhurried competence and heated water in a tin cup he produced from his saddlebag, and they shared what little remained in his provisions, a small piece of dried beef that he divided with the careful exactness of a man who understood what scarcity felt like. Susan found some dried apple slices in the bottom of her carpetbag, packed and forgotten, and she held them out, and his face lit with a genuine pleasure that made her laugh, the first real laugh she had produced in weeks. "Apples," he said, with the reverence of a man reunited with something precious. "Dried apples," she corrected, still smiling. "On this trail that is the same thing," he said firmly, and popped one into his mouth. They sat in the cottonwood shade while Cartwright drank from the creek and swished his tail at the flies, and the afternoon light filtered through the leaves and made shifting patterns on the ground. And Susan looked at Ezekiel Wells sitting across the small fire with his long legs stretched out, and his hat pushed back, and his profile turned toward the creek. And she felt something she had not expected to feel. Something she did not have a name for yet, but that settled into her chest like a warmth that had been absent for a very long time. She had come to Kansas to start over, to build something practical and sustainable from the ruins of the life that had collapsed around her. She had not come to feel this particular warmth on the banks of a creek in the middle of the plains, because a weathered, quiet-eyed cowboy had given her his last biscuit without pausing to think about whether he could afford to. She had certainly not planned on that. But the plains, she was beginning to understand, had a way of not consulting your plans. They reached the outskirts of Dodge City late in the afternoon of the following day, having camped one night on the trail where Ezekiel had slept on the ground wrapped in his coat, and given Susan his bedroll without comment, and refused every argument she offered against the arrangement. Dodge City in 1874 was a rough and busy place, the primary cattle shipping town on the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad, and Front Street was loud with the business of commerce and the particular kind of disorder that attended a town where cowboys who had been on the trail for months arrived with wages and appetites. The smell of the stockyards was heavy on the west wind, and the wooden sidewalks were crowded with a mixture of cattlemen, traders, gamblers, and townspeople going about their ordinary business in the middle of the extraordinary noise. Ezekiel rode slowly down Front Street with Susan seated behind him now, since she had agreed to that arrangement when the prairie track joined the main road, and the pace of things had made walking less sensible. She was acutely aware of the warmth of his broad back against her, the way she had placed her hands on either side of his waist, and the small, involuntary pleasure of that contact which she absolutely did not dwell on. Martha Crane's boarding house was a two-story frame building half a block off Front Street, solid and clean-looking with a painted porch, and a sign that read, "Crane's House, Respectable Rooms." A heavy-set woman with a round, pleasant face and iron-gray hair appeared on the porch as they rode up, and her expression moved quickly from curiosity to recognition when Susan climbed down from Cartwright and introduced herself. "Susan Lockhart," Martha said, coming down the porch steps with her hand already extended. "I had begun to wonder. Your letter said the first week of May." "My wagon broke down east of the Cottonwood," Susan said. "I would have been in worse condition than I am if not for Mr. Wells here." Martha looked up at Ezekiel with shrewd, warm eyes. "Ezekiel Wells," she said, with the familiarity of a woman who had been in Dodge City long enough to know everyone's name. "Dale Hartwell's foreman." "Yes, ma'am," he said, touching his hat. "You get off that horse and come inside for supper," Martha said, in a tone that was not quite a request. Ezekiel looked briefly at Susan, who gave him the smallest nod, and he swung down from the saddle and tied Cartwright to the post at the porch. Inside, Martha's boarding house was clean and warm-smelling, with a long table in the dining room already set for the evening meal, and the other boarders filing in included a pair of cattle buyers, a young telegraph operator named Albert Pine, who could not have been more than 20 and regarded Susan with the frank admiration of a boy not yet skilled at disguising his feelings, and a quiet older woman named Harriet Doyle, who had been in Dodge since the town was barely a settlement, and had the calm authority that comes from having outlasted most of what the frontier can throw at a person. Supper was a genuine luxury after the trail. Martha served roasted beef and boiled potatoes and cornbread with butter, and the simple abundance of it made Susan's eyes sting briefly with something she quickly blinked away. Ezekiel sat across from her at the table and ate with the focused appreciation of a man who had been on the trail for several weeks, and the conversation around the table moved in the loose, comfortable way of a shared meal among people who are not strangers to each other. After supper, Ezekiel helped clear the table without being asked, which earned him a look of unmistakable approval from Martha Crane. And then he and Susan stood on the porch in the cooling evening air, while the sky turned from orange to deep purple above the flat Kansas horizon. The noise of Front Street carried to them on the wind, fiddle music and raised voices, and the distant sound of the cattle pens. And Susan leaned against the porch railing and looked at the sky, and felt something in her chest that was close to peace, which she had not expected to feel in Dodge City. "I should see to Cartwright and find a place to stable him," Ezekiel said, and his voice in the evening quiet was somehow different from how it had sounded on the trail, more careful, like a man choosing his words. "Of course," Susan said. She turned from the railing and faced him, and in the fading light his eyes were very dark and very direct. "Ezekiel, I want to thank you again. Properly. What you did out there on the trail, the water, the biscuit, the company, it was more than I had any right to expect from a stranger." "You were not a stranger," he said, which was not quite logical given that they had met that morning, and yet it did not feel false. It felt, if anything, entirely accurate in the way that certain people you meet are not strangers in the ordinary sense of the word from the very first moments. "No," she said quietly, "I suppose not." He held her gaze for a moment longer than was strictly conversational, and then he settled his hat and said, "The Rocking W is 3 days east of here. I will be heading back tomorrow morning, most likely." He paused. "But I come into Dodge with the supply runs and the occasional herd." "More often than not." "Well," Susan said carefully, "you know where Martha Crane's boarding house is." "I do," he said. And then he smiled, that particular warm and unhurried smile that had been doing interesting things to her composure ever since she first saw it. And he touched his hat brim and stepped down from the porch, and led Cartwright up the street toward the livery. Susan watched him go and then stood in the cooling air for a while longer, listening to the busy sounds of Dodge City and thinking about the unlikely sequence of events that had brought her to this porch, this town, and this particular evening feeling of cautious hopefulness that she had not experienced in over a year. Martha Crane appeared at the screen door behind her. "That is a good man," the older woman said, without preamble. "I only met him today," Susan said. "I know," Martha said. "I said what I said." The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that Susan found genuinely satisfying. Her work at the boarding house was real and demanding, the seamstress work she had been hired to do, but also a great deal more, helping Martha with the cooking and the management of the house and occasionally with the accounts, which Martha kept in a large ledger with more determination than precision. Susan had a decent hand with numbers, learned from her father who had kept meticulous farm records, and she set about organizing Martha's books with a quiet efficiency that made the older woman look at her with an expression that was something very close to maternal fondness. Dodge City in the spring of 1874 was a place in constant, loud motion. The cattle season was beginning, and the herds coming up from Texas were arriving with their attendant noise and commerce and disorder. Susan learned the rhythms of Front Street, when to walk on which side to avoid the worst of the chaos, which establishments were safe and which were not, and she learned to move through the town with the purposeful confidence of a woman who belongs to herself and knows it. Martha was a good employer and a better friend, blunt and funny, and fiercely protective of the women who worked in her house. Susan thought about Ezekiel Wells more than was sensible for a woman who had spent exactly 2 days in his company. She thought about the way he had held out the canteen with both hands, the care and the gesture. She thought about the biscuit, the simplicity and the generosity of it, and the way he had turned away so that she could eat it without the weight of being watched. She thought about his voice in the evening on Martha's porch, and the particular sentence he had spoken, "You are not a stranger." She turned that sentence over in her mind at odd moments, washing dishes, threading a needle, listening to the cattle sounds drift in from the stockyards on the evening air. 3 weeks after she arrived in Dodge, he came back. She was on the porch in the afternoon, doing mending in the good light, when Cartwright came ambling down the cross street with Ezekiel in the saddle, and she did not notice him at first because she was focused on a particularly stubborn seam. It was Cartwright's distinctive gait she recognized before anything else, a slightly rolling quality to the bay's walk, and she looked up and met Ezekiel's eyes as he caught sight of her, and his horse slowed to a stop as if of its own accord. He was dusty from the trail and his jaw was several days unshaven, and he looked, in Susan's private estimation, entirely wonderful. "Susan Lockhart," he said from the saddle, with a tone that managed to be both casual and warm in the same breath. "Ezekiel Wells," she returned, setting her mending on the chair beside her and standing up. "You look like you have been on the trail." "Supply run to Wichita," he said, swinging down from Cartwright. "Dale needed fencing wire and a pump mechanism, neither of which Dodge carries in adequate quantity." He tied Cartwright to the porch post with the comfortable habit of a man who had done it before, which he had. "I thought I might stop and see how you were settling." "Well," she said, watching him come up the porch steps, "you are in luck because Martha is making beef stew tonight and she always makes too much." Martha, it turned out, did not believe in too much when it came to beef stew, but she made a generous extra portion without any particular comment, and that evening Ezekiel sat at the boarding house table again, and the conversation around it was easier and better for the fact that everyone there was no longer new to each other. After supper, they walked. It was not a planned thing. It happened the way natural things happen, Susan picking up her shawl and stepping off the porch, Ezekiel falling into step beside her with his hat in his hand, and the two of them moving along the quieter streets away from Front Street, where the evening was almost peaceful if you chose the right direction. The sky above Dodge City was enormous and filled with stars, the kind of sky that you only understand the full scale of when you are standing in flat country with nothing between you and the horizon. "How are you, truly?" he asked, and the directly personal nature of the question, coming from someone who had seen her at her lowest point on that trail, landed differently than the social version of the same question. She considered it honestly. "Better than I expected," she said. "Martha is a good person. The work is real. The town is loud, but I am adjusting to the noise." She paused. "I feel like I am building something. I did not feel that way 3 weeks ago." "3 weeks ago you were in a considerable difficulty," he said. "I was," she agreed. "And you helped me through it." She glanced at him sideways. "I meant what I said on the trail, Ezekiel, about the biscuit being the kindest thing. I know it sounds like a small thing to be moved by." He stopped walking. She stopped a half step later and turned to face him. In the starlight his expression was serious and open in a way that made her breath come slightly different. "It does not sound small to me," he said. "I have been on the receiving end of a genuine kindness when I needed one, and I know what it feels like." He turned his hat in his hands. "After my father died, I was 17 and I had nothing. Not a dollar, not a plan, not a person. There was a man in Abilene, an old drover named Crockett, who did not know me from any stranger on the street, and he gave me 3 days' work and a meal, and told me something about the trail that I have been using ever since." He paused. "I never forgot that. I think sometimes those small things are the ones that hold a person together when everything else has come apart." Susan was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said softly, "that is exactly what it was." They stood in the starlit street and looked at each other, and the distance between them was not very much, and it seemed, in that moment, considerably smaller than the physical measurement would suggest. "I would like to come back to Dodge," he said. "More deliberately, I mean, not just when the supply runs happen to point this direction." "I would like that," she said, and she did not pretend otherwise because she had no patience left for pretending. He smiled, and even in the dim light she could see it, and then he put his hat back on and they turned and walked back toward the boarding house, and the conversation shifted to lighter things, to the horses he was breaking at the Rocking W, to a cook stove Martha had recently acquired that worked with wonderful efficiency, to the books in the small case in the boarding house parlor, and whether he read, which he did, steadily if slowly. and she mentioned that she had a copy of David Copperfield in her carpetbag that had survived the whole journey from Leavenworth. And he said he had read the first part of it once but never finished it, and she said that was a serious situation that needed to be addressed. Over the next 4 months, Ezekiel Wells came to Dodge City 8 times. Some of those visits lasted an afternoon and an evening. 2 of them lasted 2 days. The shortest visit lasted exactly long enough for him to deliver supplies to the general store on behalf of the Rocking W, eat dinner at Martha Crane's table, and sit on the porch with Susan in the cooling evening air for 2 hours before he had to ride back to be at the ranch by morning. Susan counted those hours afterward and was annoyed with herself for counting them. Martha watched all of this with the amused satisfaction of a woman who has figured out the shape of a thing before the people in the middle of it have fully articulated it to themselves. She said nothing directly, which was the most tactful she had been on any subject in recent memory, though once she remarked to Harriet Doyle that Ezekiel Wells was the kind of man who showed his nature in small actions rather than large speeches, and Harriet, who had been in the West long enough to know the difference, said that was the rarest and most reliable kind. The book was a good excuse for things that did not strictly need excuses. Susan had offered to read David Copperfield with Ezekiel during one of his longer visits, which had turned into the 2 of them sitting side by side in the parlor chairs while she read aloud, and he listened with a quality of attention that she found oddly moving, the way he was entirely present in the reading, asking questions about the characters as if they were people he might encounter, reacting to the story's turns with a directness that had not been polished into the polite half-attention that most people offered in those situations. He was not a complicated man in the way that means contradictory or evasive. He was complex in a different way, in the way of someone whose inner life was rich but private, who chose action as the primary language of his character and used words selectively and with care. When he said something important, it meant something, because he was not in the habit of filling silence with noise. In August, on a dry and brilliant afternoon, he rode into Dodge City on Cartwright and walked directly to the boarding house and found Susan in the back garden where she had been hanging laundry, and he stood at the garden gate with his hat in his hands and said, with the directness that was entirely his own, "Susan, I have been thinking about something for the past 3 months, and I have decided I would rather say it plainly than continue not saying it." She turned from the clothesline and looked at him. She was aware of the clothespin in her hand and the basket at her feet and the white sheets blowing in the dry Kansas wind, and none of those things registered as anything other than the background of this particular moment. "I am in love with you," he said. "I have been for some time. I realize that we have spent this summer getting acquainted in pieces, and perhaps that is not the standard way of things, but I know my own mind on this and I thought you should know it." He paused. "I am not a wealthy man. The Rocking W pays me a foreman's wage, which is decent, and Dale Hartwell has spoken of giving me a partial stake in the ranch in another year if things continue well. I have a small piece of land east of the main ranch that I have been holding the deed to for 2 years, planning to build on. I am telling you all of this because it seems relevant to the rest of what I want to say." Susan stood in the garden with the clothespin in her hand and her heart beating with an altogether disproportionate energy, and she looked at Ezekiel Wells standing at her gate with all of his honest and practical love laid out in plain terms, and she thought about how she had spent 4 months admiring his quiet ways and his steady kindness, and the way he turned serious, and the way he smiled, and how she had built her admiration into something considerably larger and warmer than admiration without ever quite calling it by its name. "You are asking me to marry you," she said. "I am," he said, "if you would consider it. I am asking you to think about it carefully and tell me your real answer, not the polite one." She crossed the garden, took the gate latch and opened it, and stepped out to where he was standing. She looked up at him and said, "My real answer is yes, and it has been accumulating toward yes since the morning on the trail when you handed me a canteen with both hands and then gave me your last biscuit without pausing long enough to think about whether you could afford to." She paused. "A man who gives like that, quietly and without keeping a ledger of it, that is the kind of man I want to stand beside." Ezekiel looked at her for a long moment with an expression that was the quietest and most complete version of happiness she had ever seen on a human face. Then he reached out and took her free hand in both of his, the same gesture he had used with the canteen on the trail, both hands, unhurried and careful, and he said, "Susan Lockhart, you are the finest person I have met in 31 years of living, and I intend to spend a considerable number of additional years telling you so." She laughed, which was the only appropriate response to that, and she did not let go of his hand. Martha Crane received the news with the restrained triumph of a woman who has been correct about something for months and has been graciously waiting for the people involved to arrive at the same conclusion. She immediately produced a bottle of rye whiskey from the back of the kitchen cabinet, which she said she kept for medical emergencies, and poured 3 glasses, and toasted them with a brevity that nonetheless managed to convey genuine feeling. Harriet Doyle said she had known since May, which nobody disputed. The wedding was planned for October, to give Susan time to write to what distant family remained in Missouri, and to give Ezekiel time to make arrangements with Dale Hartwell about his schedule and his intentions. Dale Hartwell, who was a blunt man from Ohio who ran cattle and valued loyalty and competence above most things, received the news of his foreman's impending marriage with a grunt of approval, and then immediately began calculating how to use the occasion to expand his operation, proposing that if Ezekiel and Susan settled the land east of the main ranch, it would put an additional set of capable hands within easy reach, and also extend the effective range of the Rocking W. He offered Ezekiel a formal partnership stake, earlier than originally discussed, in recognition of the settlement. Ezekiel accepted, negotiated the terms with the calm precision of a man who understood both his own value and the appropriate limits of expectation, and came back to Dodge City to tell Susan about it with the specific quiet pride of someone who has worked a long time towards something and now sees it taking solid shape. The land east of the Rocking W main house was a good piece of ground, Ezekiel told her. 160 acres by the terms of the Homestead Act, with a shallow creek running through the south end, and a stand of hardwoods that would provide shelter from the worst of the winter winds. He had been paying the filing fee and holding the claim for 2 years. There was no house on it yet, only the frame he had begun roughing out the previous fall before winter closed in. "I can build a house," he said, with the quiet certainty of a man who has done most of the physical work of his life with his own hands and does not find the prospect daunting. "I know you can," she said, "and I can help." He looked at her with that expression again, the one that was direct and warm and very slightly surprised, as if she continued to say things that landed in the exact place he had not quite expected. "I know you can," he said back, and he meant it exactly as much as she had. The letter Susan had sent to her mother's youngest sister, Aunt Clara, in St. Joseph, Missouri, came back with a reply that was long and warm and full of cautious joy on Susan's behalf, though Clara was clear that the journey to Kansas for a wedding was beyond her means that year. Susan read the letter twice and felt the familiar pang of being far from anyone who had known her father, who had known her as a girl. And then she folded it carefully and wrote a response describing Ezekiel in terms she thought her aunt would find reassuring, and included the news about the land and the ranch partnership, which she knew would matter to Clara, who was practical above all things. The one person from her father's world who had proven himself genuinely reliable during the worst of the past year had been a man named George Hollies, the neighboring farmer who had helped manage the estate and who had treated Susan's grief with a simple and uncomplicating decency. She wrote to George as well, more briefly, telling him she had found work and now more than that, telling him she was well. She folded both letters and paid Albert Pine at the telegraph office to send word ahead to the mail rider, and then she went back to the boarding house and felt, for the first time in a very long time, that the world ahead of her was larger and better than the world behind. The September before the wedding was the most beautiful month Susan had spent in years. The Kansas heat broke in the second week, and the light turned from white to gold, and the prairie grass went amber and the cottonwoods along the creeks went yellow. And on the Sunday that Ezekiel rode in and they rode out together toward the land he had been claiming, she sat up behind him on Cartwright with her hands on his waist and looked at the open country and felt something she could only call joy, which was a word she had been using carefully, but which she used now without reservation. The land was everything he had described. The creek ran clear and shallow over flat stones, and the cottonwoods stood gold-leafed and enormous along its banks, and the surrounding grass rippled in the light wind with a sound like breathing. Ezekiel showed her the frame he had roughed out, the placement he had chosen for the house, the orientation that would give the kitchen windows morning light and put the main rooms out of the worst of the winter wind. He talked about it with a particular detailed attention that told her he had been imagining it for a long time. The kitchen here, the parlor there, 2 bedrooms to begin with, a porch along the south face to catch the afternoon sun. "You have thought about this quite a lot," she said. "I have thought about it considerably more in the past 4 months," he said, with the edge of a smile. She walked the perimeter of the planned house with him and offered her own thoughts, which he listened to with the same quality of full attention he gave to everything she said, and where she suggested changes, the placement of a window, the width of the porch. He considered them and either agreed or explained his reasoning for the original plan, and the negotiation of it was one of the most satisfying conversations she had ever had, because it was entirely concrete and entirely about building something real together. The wedding took place on a Saturday in late October 1874, in the parlor of Martha Crane's boarding house, conducted by the circuit minister who came through Dodge every 3 weeks. Martha had decorated the parlor with dried flowers and a length of blue calico she had ordered specifically for the occasion, and Harriet Doyle had baked a cake from a recipe she said had come from her grandmother in Virginia, which was a recipe she had not used in 15 years, and produced something magnificent. The boarders were all present, including Albert Pine, who looked touchingly young and happy in a way that had nothing particular to do with the wedding, except the general contagion of the occasion. Dale Hartwell rode in from the Rocking W with his wife, a capable woman named Frances who shook Susan's hand with the firm grip of someone who did not waste time on unnecessary ceremony, and then said, "Dale tells me you have a good head for accounts. We are glad you are coming." Ezekiel stood at the front of the parlor in his good coat, which was dark blue wool and had been pressed by someone with evident care, and when Susan came in on Martha's arm, which had been Martha's own suggestion, and which Susan had accepted with a feeling that tightened her throat, Ezekiel looked at her with an expression of such direct and unguarded love that she had to take a careful breath before she could walk steadily. She wore her best dress, which was the green wool she had kept back from the creditors because they had not itemized it, and she had not volunteered the information. She had put her hair up simply and borrowed a pair of pearl ear drops from Martha that had belonged to Martha's own mother, and she held a small bunch of dried grasses and late wild asters that Ezekiel had gathered that morning, and handed to her with a gravity that had made her eyes sting. The minister was a pleasant man named Reverend Greer, who conducted the ceremony with brevity and warmth, and the particular quality of sincerity that belongs to someone who has performed this office in enough difficult circumstances to understand what it actually means. When he reached the question of the vows, Ezekiel turned to face Susan fully and spoke his answers in the low, steady voice she had come to love specifically, the one that meant he was saying something he meant entirely, and Susan said hers clearly and with the distinct, private awareness that she had never in her life meant anything more. When Reverend Greer said they were married, Martha made a sound that was not quite a sob but was in the same neighborhood, and Frances Hartwell smiled with a warmth that transformed her brisk face. And Albert Pine started to clap, and then looked around and stopped, and then clapped again when everyone else joined in. Ezekiel kissed his wife in front of the blue calico and dried flowers and the whole assembly of their Dodge City people. And it was a kiss that was both entirely proper and entirely personal. And Susan placed her hand on his chest where she could feel his heart beating and thought, clearly and with perfect certainty, that this was the best and most true thing that had happened to her in 31 years. The first winter on the homestead land was the kind that tests a person's commitment to their choices. Ezekiel had worked through October and into November with help from two of the Rocking W hands, good men named Caleb Morin and Pete Ruiz, to get the house frame up, and the walls in, and the roof on before the first serious cold came down from the north. They had moved in on the 1st of December, into a house that was warm if not yet finished, with 2 rooms done to a reasonable standard and the rest of the interior still rough. Susan had been in houses that were finer, and she had been in houses that were harder. This one was hers, which made it the best she had ever lived in. She learned the rhythms of ranch life with the same steady, practical attention she had given everything else. She learned to read the weather in the way of the prairie, in the color of the morning sky, and the behavior of the horses, and the particular quality of the wind. She learned to manage a kitchen garden through the short Kansas growing season, to preserve and store and plan meals through the winter with the exact efficiency that survival requires. She helped Ezekiel with the ranch accounts, which had previously been Dale Hartwell's province, and which Dale surrendered to Susan's management with something very close to relief, because he was a man who understood cattle and grass, but for whom columns of numbers produced a specific form of mental fatigue. The partnership with Dale Hartwell grew into something genuine and productive. The Rocking W's operation had expanded with Ezekiel's foreman work over the past 2 years, adding 3 new sections of land and increasing the herd, and with the partial stake formally recorded and Susan managing the books, the shape of what Ezekiel and Susan were building together became clearer and more solid every month. Dale's respect for Susan was swift and unconditional once he understood the quality of her intelligence and the precision of her work, and Frances Hartwell became something like a friend, visiting on Sundays when the weather allowed and corresponding by letter when it did not. In the spring of 1875, Susan discovered she was expecting their first child, and she told Ezekiel on an April evening when they were sitting on the south porch watching the sun go down behind the grass, and his face went through several things in quick succession before settling on a happiness so large and undefended that she had to reach out and put her hand over his. "A baby," he said, which was not his most eloquent moment, but she found it entirely perfect. "A baby," she confirmed. He covered her hand with his other hand, the habitual gesture that was so thoroughly his, and they sat on the porch in the April light for a long time without needing to say much else. The summer of 1875 brought a drought that hit the Kansas plains with particular severity, reducing the grass in July and August to a brittle brown that crackled under the horses' hooves, and made every rancher in the county look at the sky, with a combination of worry and prayer. Ezekiel managed the herd through it with the careful resource management of a man who has seen bad conditions before and knows that panic wastes the energy that calm strategy can preserve. He moved cattle to the creek pastures where the grass held better and negotiated with a neighboring operation to share a section of watered land through the worst months, a fair arrangement that cost both sides something, but cost them less than the alternative. Susan, who was visibly pregnant through the summer heat and less physically agile than her usual efficient self, redirected her energy to the household economy and the accounts with the systematic thoroughness that was her characteristic mode of meeting difficulty. She corresponded with Martha Crane in Dodge, who was a reliable source of information about market prices and supply availability, and she wrote to Frances Hartwell about a cooperative arrangement for the next season's hay supply that Frances thought was a strong idea and brought to Dale, who agreed. Through the heat and the drought and the discomfort of a summer pregnancy in a house that got considerably warm in August, Susan and Ezekiel managed. They managed with the specific competence of two people who have each independently survived difficult things, and who together make something more resilient than either would be alone. They argued sometimes, because both of them had opinions and both of them were accustomed to carrying their own judgment, and the arguments were the kind that real couples have, about the right order of priorities, about how much risk was acceptable, about the stubbornness that each of them sometimes confused with principle. They always resolved them, because beneath the arguments was an absolute bedrock of mutual respect, an understanding that neither of them would trade away for the comfort of winning a particular point. The child was born in November, with Frances Hartwell in attendance and a reliable woman from the neighboring Vance homestead who had some practical experience with births. It was a long night and a harder labor than anyone had entirely prepared Susan for, and by the time it was finished she was exhausted in a way she had never before experienced, a total, cellular exhaustion that went deeper than any trail had ever taken her. But the baby was healthy and strong and loudly indignant about his arrival, a boy with Ezekiel's dark hair and Susan's gray eyes, and when Ezekiel came into the room and saw his son for the first time, he stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands and his face entirely undone with emotion. And Susan, from her position of extreme tiredness, watched him fall in love with this small person in real time and thought it was one of the finest things she had ever witnessed. They named him James Crockett Wells, the middle name for the old drover from Abilene who had given Ezekiel 3 days' work and a meal when he was 17 and had nothing. Susan thought it was the right kind of tribute, the kind that acknowledged that kindnesses propagate through time in ways the original giver never knows. James was a substantial baby who became an energetic toddler with a particular enthusiasm for mud, livestock, and the sound of horses. He had Ezekiel's steady temperament crossed with Susan's bright, observant quality, and by the time he was 2 years old, he was following Ezekiel around the ranch with a miniature seriousness that made the hands try to hide their smiles. Caleb Morin, who had become a regular presence on the homestead section as the operation grew, was particularly devoted to the boy and could frequently be found allowing himself to be bossed around by a 2-year-old in a manner entirely inconsistent with his considerable physical capabilities. The dry goods situation in 1876 brought Susan and Ezekiel into a conflict with a local supplier named Hadley who had raised his prices beyond what the county's smaller operations could sustainably manage, a common enough story in the territories where supply chains were thin and middlemen understood their leverage. Susan organized 3 of the neighboring homestead wives into a cooperative purchasing arrangement that went directly to the Wichita suppliers, cutting Hadley out of the transaction entirely for a 6-month period. The savings were meaningful, and the cooperation built relationships between the homesteads that proved valuable in other ways during the difficult winter that followed. Hadley eventually moderated his prices when he understood that the cooperative was a permanent arrangement rather than a temporary measure, and Susan accepted the negotiation's conclusion without gloating, because she had not done it to win anything against Hadley in particular, but because it was the practical solution. She talked through the whole business with Ezekiel as it was happening, not asking his permission, which he had never expected her to seek, but valuing his perspective and occasionally finding that his reading of a situation had an angle she had not considered. This was the nature of their partnership, which had grown more layered and more functional with every season, 2 people who each brought different capabilities to the same enterprise, and who had the intelligence to recognize and use the other's strengths. Martha Crane came from Dodge City in the spring of 1876 for a visit that had been planned for several months, riding out with the supply wagon that went between Dodge and the Rocking W. She arrived in the April afternoon with a large trunk and a practical hamper of food from the Dodge City bakery, and a vigorous air of anticipation. And the sight of her pulling into the yard, while young James ran to the fence in his dust-stained overalls to watch the wagon arrive, made Susan's chest tight with something that was purely warm. Martha took in the homestead with the assessing eye of a woman who knows what real work looks like, and approved of everything she saw. She sat on the south porch with Susan in the evenings, and they talked in the way that women who genuinely understand each other can talk, directly and without the elaborate social management that more formal relationships require. Martha was happy in Dodge. Her boarding house was established and successful, and she had built something there that was genuinely hers, and she said so with the matter-of-fact satisfaction of someone who has spent their life in practical industry and finds it sufficient. "You look well," Martha told Susan on the second evening, in a tone that implied more than the medical observation. "I am well," Susan said, with a completeness that meant it. "I was not entirely certain you would be, you know," Martha said. "When you arrived in Dodge off that trail looking like you had been put through a difficulty and still carrying your chin up about it." She paused. "I was fairly certain about Ezekiel in that I knew him to be a good man. I was less certain that a good man is always what a strong woman needs. Sometimes they get in each other's way." "He does not get in my way," Susan said. "No," Martha agreed. "I can see that." "He found the one who moves in the same direction." She was quiet for a moment and then said, "Your father would have liked him." Susan looked at the evening sky and said, "Yes, I think so too." The years settled and deepened. By 1878, the homestead had grown considerably. Ezekiel's partnership in the Rocking W had produced a formal equity stake, and the homestead land had been developed with a second building, a proper barn with stalls and a hay loft, and the house itself had been extended to include a proper kitchen wing and 2 additional bedrooms. The original small house that Ezekiel had roughed out in October of 1874 was barely recognizable inside the larger, better structure, though the south porch remained unchanged, because it faced the right direction, and because they had spent too many good evenings on it to alter it. In 1878, Susan discovered she was expecting a second child, and this pregnancy was easier than the first, which she attributed partly to greater knowledge and partly to the fact that the summer of 1878 was merciful and cool compared to what they had endured 3 years before. She worked through the summer with her customary efficiency, modified only by the small physical concessions that she made and did not discuss, because she was practical about her body in the way she was practical about everything else, understanding its requirements and meeting them without dramatic commentary. The second child was a girl, born in a November that was much gentler than James's, with Frances Hartwell again in attendance, and a neighbor woman who by now had assisted at 4 births on the homesteads in the county, and ran the proceedings with cheerful authority. The girl arrived with a decisiveness that suggested she had already formed opinions about her own schedule, and she had Susan's brown hair and Ezekiel's dark eyes, and she was from her first hours a person with a considerable amount of personality, which Frances said with considerable accuracy. They named her Clara Me Wells, for Susan's Aunt Clara in Missouri, who had by this time made the journey to Kansas for a visit that had been 5 years in the planning, and had been, by all accounts on both sides, entirely worth the wait. Clara had arrived the previous year, a small and lively woman in her late 40s who had taken to Ezekiel with immediate approval, and to young James with the enthusiasm of a gray-tant who has been waiting her whole life for exactly this sort of small person to dote on. She had stayed for 6 weeks, which was the right amount of time for everyone, and returned to Missouri with a promise to come again the following spring, which she honored. Naming the girl for Clara felt right. a recognition of the connections that had survived the losses and the distance. Ezekiel held his daughter in the November evening light of their bedroom while James, who was almost 3 and had been waiting with the invested seriousness of a small person who has been told for months that something important is happening, stood at the bedside looking at the new baby with an expression that moved between curiosity and a preliminary, tentative affection. Ezekiel watched his son watching his daughter and then looked at Susan in the bed with the particular quality of feeling that comes in the moments when a person recognizes the whole specific shape of their happiness and is afraid to look too directly at it in case it proves fragile. She met his eyes from the pillow and said, quietly enough for just him, "We did this." "We did," he said. "The biscuit," she said and smiled. He laughed, low and warm. "The biscuit," he agreed, sitting on the edge of the bed and looking at her with all the accumulated love of 4 years. "I have thought many times about what would have happened if I had taken the western trail that morning instead of the eastern one, or if I had been an hour later. You would have found me eventually," she said, with a certainty she had not planned but which felt entirely accurate. "I think we were heading toward each other from a very long way back." "I think you might be right," he said, and he reached out with his free hand, the hand not holding their sleeping daughter, and covered hers in the same gesture he had used on the trail, both hands careful and unhurried. James climbed up on the bed at this point and inserted himself between his parents with the territorial confidence of a toddler who has no concept of the emotional weight of the moment, but a very clear concept of his own central position. And Ezekiel caught him with one arm and Susan shifted to accommodate him. And the 4 of them were together in the November light, the old house quiet around them and the wind moving through the cottonwoods outside, and it was the finest thing Susan had ever known. The years between 1878 and 1882 were the best of their lives in many ways, though each one brought its own difficulties as years on the prairie invariably do. A spring flood in 1879 took out the south fence line along the creek and a good portion of the kitchen garden, which required a month of repair work and replanting at the worst possible time, when the hands were needed for the cattle work. Ezekiel and Susan handled it with the methodical partnership that had become their characteristic mode, dividing the labor, working from morning to dark, eating dinner on the porch some evenings, because there was no time to eat it any other way. Caleb Morin, who had been with the Rocking W operation since before Ezekiel came to Kansas, and who had become during the years something closer to family than hired hand, was seriously injured in a horse accident in the fall of 1880, breaking his arm in 3 places in a fall from a young horse that was not yet fully broken to the work. The injury healed slowly and imperfectly, leaving Caleb with a limited use of the arm that effectively ended his ability to do the heavy ranch work that had been his life. Susan, who had come to regard Caleb with the same uncomplicated affection that the rest of the household had for him, organized the practical response without waiting to be asked, rearranging the work responsibilities and the house arrangements to ensure Caleb had a place and a purpose that his modified capability could support. He moved his things into the addition that had been roughed out for storage and became, by degrees, the homestead's permanent presence, keeping the accounts when Susan was occupied elsewhere, managing the kitchen garden with meticulous satisfaction, and serving as the primary narrator and entertainer for James and Clara, who regarded him with the uncritical devotion that children extend to the adults who give them their full attention. It was Caleb who told James the old drover stories, who taught Clara to identify the different grasses by their seed heads, and who sat on the south porch in the summer evenings with the quiet contentment of a man who has found his place in the world somewhat late and values it all the more for that. Pete Ruiz, the other hand who had helped build the original frame of the house back in 1874, had gone on to establish his own small operation south of Dodge, and wrote occasionally to Ezekiel with the news of the country and the occasional request for advice, which Ezekiel always answered thoroughly and without condescension. The territory was full of men like Pete, men who had been working other people's land and were now in the process of making their own claim, and Ezekiel's approach to those relationships was shaped by his clear memory of having been exactly that kind of man himself, and by the understanding of what it cost and what it required. The cattle business in Kansas was changing through these years in ways that required constant adaptation. The great open-range era that had defined the trail drives from Texas was narrowing as the land filled with homesteads and fencing became both practical and contested, and the Rocking W, like every operation in the county, had to navigate the changing reality with a combination of legal precision and neighborly diplomacy. Ezekiel handled the fencing negotiations with the same steady care he brought to everything, understanding that the relationships with neighboring operations were long-term investments that had to be managed with more than short-term advantage in mind. There was one spring, in 1881, when a dispute over a shared water source with a larger operation to the north became briefly contentious enough that Susan spent several evenings studying the land records and water rights documentation with the concentration of a person preparing a legal argument, which in a sense she was. She presented the case to Ezekiel with the supporting documentation organized, and he took it to the county seat with a clear and evidenced position that resolved the dispute without litigation or violence, both of which had been outcomes that people were freely predicting in those weeks. The county clerk, a meticulous man named Harrison Greer, who was coincidentally the brother of the minister who had married them, said afterward that he had rarely seen a land matter presented with such completeness. Susan received this compliment secondhand through Ezekiel and said it was nice, which was less than it deserved, but she had not done it for the compliment. By 1882, James was 7 years old and Clara was 3, and the homestead was the kind of place that had grown into itself, that had the settled quality of land that has been tended and worked with consistent care. The house was comfortable and specific to its inhabitants, full of the accumulated character that comes from people who live in a place and use it honestly, tools hung in the right places, furniture arranged for actual use, books in a case in the parlor that had grown considerably from Susan's original copy of David Copperfield, which was there still, spine worn and margins occasionally annotated in 2 different handwritings. In the early spring of that year, Susan went to Dodge City for the first time in nearly a year, making the trip with Ezekiel on the supply run, and the experience of riding back into town after the long interval of the homestead was a particular kind of interesting. Dodge City itself had changed, was changing, the cattle trade gradually shifting west and north as the railroad extended and the range contracted, and the particular wild character of the early years was being replaced by something more settled, more commercial, more ordinary. The Long Branch Saloon was still there. The stockyards were still busy, though not as explosively as they had been in the peak years. The building boom had produced more substantial structures where the original frame buildings had stood, and the general quality of the town was moving in a direction that spoke of permanence rather than expediency. Martha Crane's boarding house was exactly as it had always been, because Martha ran it to a standard she had established herself and saw no reason to deviate from. She was 5 years older and slightly less energetic, but not in any way that diminished her essential quality, and she sat with Susan in the kitchen on the afternoon of their arrival and talked for 3 hours with the uninterrupted directness of 2 women who have enough mutual trust to say the things that matter without the scaffolding of social courtesy. Martha's health was not, Susan understood by the end of the afternoon, entirely good. Nothing catastrophic, Martha was firm on this point, but there was a persistent difficulty with her breathing through the past winter that had not resolved with the spring weather, and the doctor in Dodge had recommended she think about whether Dodge City's particular quality of air, which included a considerable amount of stock dust from the yards, was the best environment for a person with her lungs. Susan said nothing for a moment, and then she said, "Martha, if you wanted to close the boarding house or find someone to take it over, there is a place for you at the homestead. We have the room and we would have you." Martha looked at her with an expression that was complicated and warm. "I did not come here to ask for that," she said. "I know," Susan said. "I am saying it anyway." Martha looked at her for another moment and then said, "I will think about it," which from Martha Crane was very nearly the same as yes. She came in the fall, 2 months before the first serious frost, with her trunk and her hamper and the kind of practical determination she brought to everything. She settled into the additional bedroom with a minimum of fuss, and became immediately and organically part of the homestead's life in a way that felt, as Susan told Ezekiel on the south porch that first evening, like she had always been there. "You were planning this," Ezekiel said, not quite an accusation. "I was hoping for it," Susan said. "Which is different." He considered this. "Not very different," he said. "No," she admitted, "but different." He smiled and she smiled, and the evening breeze moved through the cottonwoods with its dry, gentle sound, and the lights in the house behind them were warm and solid, and inside that warmth were James and Clara and Caleb and Martha, the full specific count of the people who had come to mean the world to them. The winter of 1882 into 1883 was long and cold, the kind of Kansas winter that the old-timers talked about in terms of which one it compared to, measuring current difficulty against the standard of harder winters past. The homestead came through it in good order, because Susan had spent the autumn in the methodical provisioning that was her particular form of anxiety management, storing and preserving and calculating with the precision of someone who has thought carefully about what a long winter requires and does not like to be wrong. The cattle management through the cold months was Ezekiel's primary occupation, moving the herd to sheltered ground and managing the feed supply through the worst of it, and he did it with the same efficient, unfrantic competence that Susan had come to understand was simply his nature. By the spring of 1883, Susan was 33 years old and Ezekiel was 39, and the life they had built was the thing they had both, in different ways, been moving toward from a very long way back. The ranch partnership with Dale Hartwell had produced a formal division of operations in which the homestead section was functionally independent while retaining the cooperative arrangements that benefited both operations, and the land deed was in both names, which had required a specific legal effort in a territory where such things were not automatic, but which Ezekiel had pursued with the same patient precision as everything else. James, at 8, was already spending time with the horses in a way that showed genuine feeling for them, the same quality his father had, a patience and a steadiness that the animals responded to without reservation. Clara, at 4, had the observing, categorizing quality of Susan's intelligence applied to the entire natural world, and moved through the ranch collecting information about everything from caterpillar behavior to the mechanics of the hand pump with equal enthusiasm. She had, additionally, a head full of opinions that she expressed with a directness that made Caleb snort with surprised laughter on a regular basis, and that made Susan recognize herself from a very young age. The life on the homestead was not always easy and never entirely without difficulty. The work was constant, and the rewards were real but not automatic, and there were seasons that required more from both of them than seemed entirely sustainable. But through all of it, the essential quality of what Susan and Ezekiel had built together held firm, the specific warmth between them that had begun on a Kansas trail, with a canteen held in both hands and a biscuit offered without calculation, and that had grown through every season into something that was the foundation of everything else in both their lives. On the anniversary of that day on the trail, each year, Susan made biscuits for breakfast. She made them better than any trail biscuit had ever been, risen and golden and served with butter and honey, and she made them specifically because the memory of the first one was a thing she did not want either of them to forget. On the 5th anniversary, Ezekiel came into the kitchen on a May morning and found the biscuits on the table and looked at her with the direct, warm expression that she had loved for 5 years and would love for as long as there was anything left to love. And he said, "You are remarkable, Susan Wells." "I have been telling you that for years," she said, which was not quite true. She had said no such thing directly, but which made him laugh. "You have," he agreed, and came to her across the kitchen and kissed her with the same intention and the same care that had characterized everything he had ever done, and she put her hands on either side of his face, this weathered, honest, steady face that she knew better than she had ever known anything, and kissed him back. James appeared in the kitchen doorway at this moment and said, with the resigned patience of a 9-year-old who has encountered this situation before, "Are you going to do that for long?" "Indefinitely," his father informed him without breaking the moment. James retreated to find Clara and report that breakfast was going to be a few more minutes, and Susan laughed against Ezekiel's mouth and he held her, and the morning light came through the kitchen windows that she had specified should face east, and the biscuits cooled on the table and were eaten, eventually, by 6 people around a table that had seen enough mornings together to have its own particular history, and every one of them was good. By 1885, the Rocking W partnership had evolved into something that reflected the full scale of what Ezekiel and Susan had built. Dale Hartwell, who was aging and whose wife Frances had been dealing with a persistent illness through the previous 2 years, made a proposal to Ezekiel in the spring of that year that amounted to a formal transfer of the primary operation, with Dale and Frances retaining the original ranch house and a comfortable pension drawn from the operation's returns, while Ezekiel took on the full management and majority ownership of the consolidated ranch. It was the culmination of 15 years of steady work and the recognition that the Rocking W's future was in the hands that had been managing it in practice for the better part of a decade. Susan and Ezekiel sat on the south porch the evening after Ezekiel returned from that conversation with Dale and talked through it for a long time, not because either of them doubted the decision, but because they made decisions together, and this one deserved the full weight of both their thinking. The financial terms were fair and sustainable. The operational continuity was well established. The responsibilities were significant but not beyond what they could carry, especially with Caleb's continued contribution and with James, who was now 10 and developing into a serious and capable young person, as part of the long picture. "Dale asked me," Ezekiel said near the end of the conversation, "how I had managed to build what I had built. He meant the ranch, but I think he also meant the rest of it." He paused. I told him the honest truth. "What did you tell him?" Susan asked. "I told him I met a woman on the trail in 1874 who looked the difficulty of her situation in the face without flinching, and that any man with sense would want to build his life alongside someone like that." He paused again. He said that was the kind of foreman he had always hoped to have. Susan looked at the prairie evening and said, "That is a very good thing to be told." "It was," he said. "I told him I got the better end of the arrangement." She reached over and took his hand, and they sat in the settling dark while the first stars appeared above the flat Kansas horizon, and the house behind them was lit and warm and full of the sound of Martha's voice, telling Clara something in the kitchen, and James's boots on the wooden floor, and Caleb's low laugh at something one of the children had said. And the full specific beauty of the life they had built was in every one of those ordinary sounds. Dale and Frances Hartwell moved to a smaller arrangement on the eastern edge of the original ranch property, and the transition of management was smooth and complete by that fall, formalized at the county seat with the same precision that Susan brought to every legal and financial matter of the ranch. The new arrangement was recorded under the partnership name of Wells and Hartwell, because Ezekiel insisted on honoring what Dale had built by keeping his name in it, which was the kind of gesture that was entirely characteristic of him, and that Dale, when told, received with a dignity that covered what was evidently a very full feeling. Francis Hartwell's health improved gradually through 1885, which was a relief to everyone and particularly to Dale, whose worry about her had been the most visible emotion anyone had seen in a man not given to visible emotions. By the following spring she was strong enough for the visits that she and Susan had maintained through the years, and the four of them ate together on a Sunday in April with James and Clara and Martha and Caleb, around the long table that Ezekiel had built himself the previous winter, long enough for everyone who needed to fit, and the conversation around it was the comfortable, layered kind that belongs to people who have been through difficulty together and arrived at the other side, still standing and still glad of each other's company. The summer of 1886 was warm and dry but not disastrously so, and the ranch came through the cattle season in good order, the herd healthy and the returns solid. James, who was 11 now, spent his summer in a practical education that his parents deliberately shaped around the reality of what his life was going to look like: the ranch, the land, the work, and the responsibilities that came with a family operation of this scale. He took to it without complaint, and with a quiet enthusiasm that was recognizably his father's quality, a genuine engagement with the work rather than a performance of engagement. And Ezekiel, watching his son move through the ranch work with the same focused attention that had characterized Ezekiel's own development at the same age, had the specific satisfaction of a man who can see something being passed on correctly. Clara, at 7, was the current primary source of complexity at the homestead, not because she was difficult in the way of a genuinely troublesome child, but because she had a mind that moved faster than any single task could satisfy, and a will that was formidably developed for her age. She had learned to read at 5, taught by Susan and then expanded by Martha, who proved to be an excellent and patient reading teacher, and by 6, she was working through the books in the parlor case with a systematic appetite that had necessitated a trip to Dodge City to purchase additional volumes. She had also, by the time she was 7, developed opinions about the ranch operation that she expressed freely and that were, on several occasions, functionally correct, which Ezekiel acknowledged and Susan carefully encouraged while reminding Clara that being right was not always the same as being tactful, a lesson Clara found intellectually convincing and personally difficult to apply. Martha, in the late years of the decade, was slowing in the way that people slow when they have worked hard all their lives, and their body begins to insist on acknowledgement. She was not ill in any acute way, but she had the particular quality of a person moving into a quieter register, doing less but with no less quality, sitting more on the south porch and watching the land with the contentment of a woman who has built her life honestly and has nothing that requires urgent doing. Susan sat with her often on those evenings, and their conversations in the autumn porch light were among the finest of Susan's life, ranging freely across everything they had known and done and thought, with the particular liberty of talk between two people who trust each other entirely. Martha died in the winter of 1888, quietly in her sleep on a January night when the temperature had dropped to the single digits, and the wind was building outside, which seemed appropriate in its way, the kind of night that invites a person to settle deeper into warmth and not trouble themselves with waking. Susan found her in the morning and spent a private few minutes sitting beside her bed before she came out to tell the others, and what she felt was grief that was not the sharp, disorienting grief of unexpected loss, but the deeper, full ache of losing someone who has been fully present in your life, and whose absence reconfigures the shape of every day. Ezekiel was steady in those days in the particular way he had of carrying difficult things, not minimizing them but not losing himself in them either, being entirely present and reliable while she grieved, which was what she needed from him and what he gave without being asked. They buried Martha on a rise at the eastern edge of the homestead, which Susan had chosen because it faced the direction Martha had come from, and because on a clear day you could see a long way in that direction. Reverend Greer's son, who had taken over his father's circuit, conducted the service, and the people who came were the people who had known Martha in Dodge City and in the county over the years, a larger number than anyone had formally organized, gathered because they knew to come. Susan stood at the grave in the January cold with Ezekiel beside her and his hand in hers and James standing straight and serious at her other side, and Clara holding Caleb's hand on the far side of the small assembly. And she thought about the day she had arrived at Martha's boarding house off the trail, dusty and grateful, and not quite admitting how frightened she had been, and how much of everything good in her life had grown from that arrival. Martha had been the ground that received the seed. She said so at the service, briefly and plainly, which was how Martha would have wanted things said. The years after that were the steady years, the accumulating years, the kind that a person looks back on from a distance and sees not as the dramatic years but as the true years, the years when the life they have built is being actually lived. The ranch continued to grow and manage and respond to the changes in the cattle industry with the adaptive steadiness that Ezekiel brought to all complex things. Susan's management of the accounts and the cooperative arrangements she maintained with neighboring operations meant that the Wells and Hartwell operation weathered the harder seasons better than most, and by 1890 it had a stability and a reputation in the county that reflected 15 years of consistent, honest work. James turned 15 in 1890, and was by that time a young man who moved through the ranch work with a confidence and a competence that made the hired hands treat him with the respect due someone who has earned it, rather than merely inherited a position. He had his father's ease with horses and his mother's clear-eyed assessment of situations, and he was developing the beginnings of an individual character that was his own, thoughtful in a way that was slightly different from either parent, inclined toward the contemplative and the patient in a way that boded well for his future as a rancher, and possibly for anything else he chose to do. Clara, at 11, was already more educated than most women in the county, and was pressing for the next level of it with the specific, informed determination of someone who knows what she wants and has done the research to understand the path to it. She had written, with Susan's help, to a school in Kansas City that offered advanced education for young women, and the correspondence had produced an encouraging reply about their requirements. Susan was quietly proud and openly supportive, and Ezekiel, who had navigated his own position on the question of what was appropriate for a girl child on the frontier, and arrived at the conclusion that what was appropriate was whatever Clara was capable of, backed his wife and daughter with the same quiet completeness he brought to everything that mattered to him. Caleb, who had been part of the household longer than Clara had been alive, died in the autumn of 1891, of a heart failure that came without much warning and took him in a week. He was in his late 60s, which was a good age for a man who had spent his entire adult life in physical work, and he had had the particular contentment of his years at the homestead, the purpose and the belonging, and he had not been in much pain in the end, which was a mercy. James and Clara took his loss hard in different ways, James turning quieter and working longer hours, Clara crying with the full force of her considerable emotional capacity, and then channeling the grief into a piece of writing about Caleb that she read aloud to her parents on the porch one evening, a portrait of him so precise and warm and true that Susan had to press her handkerchief to her mouth, and Ezekiel sat very still, and then said, quietly, "That is the best thing I have read in a long time." Clara it was. They buried Caleb beside Martha on the eastern rise, because it was right that they should be together there, two people who had been part of the household through its making and its best years. By 1893, the homestead had the settled, substantial quality of a place that has been established for nearly 2 decades. The house was large and warm and full of the particular accumulation that happens in a home where real life is lived, books and tools and the everyday objects that acquire meaning through daily use, the table that Ezekiel had built, the quilt that Susan had made through 3 consecutive winter evenings, the photographs that a traveling photographer had taken in 1887 that hung in the parlor, Ezekiel and Susan on the south porch, James with Cartwright's successor, a gray gelding named Beck. Clara standing with her arms folded, looking directly at the camera, with an expression of considerable opinion. Cartwright had died of old age in 1885, peacefully in his own stall, which Ezekiel had sat beside on a cold November evening for a long time after. He had been a good horse through 11 years and several hundred miles of Kansas trail, and the gray gelding Beck, who came afterward, was a different animal and a good one, though Ezekiel would always have a particular quality of remembering for the bay who had been his horse on the day everything changed. James married in 1895, a young woman named Helen Vance from the neighboring homestead, the daughter of the same family who had provided the neighbor woman at his birth, and the wedding was at the homestead in a spring ceremony that had the particular warm quality of a celebration among people who have known each other long enough to mean the happiness they express. Helen was a steady and practical person with a good sense of humor and a clear eye, and Susan liked her immediately, and with the specific approval of a mother-in-law who has been paying attention to her son for a long time and is glad to see him choose well. Clara had, by this time, completed 2 years at the Kansas City School and returned to the county with a formal education that made her the most formally educated woman in the surrounding area and an informally recognized resource for the county's school, which she had begun contributing to in ways that the school board eventually formalized into an official teaching position. She had not married, which was her deliberate choice and which her parents supported without making a ceremony of the support, understanding that their daughter's intelligence and will were her own to direct, and that the direction she chose was worthy of respect. The first grandchild arrived in 1896, a boy, born to James and Helen in a November that felt to Susan remarkably like the November of James's own birth, cold and still, and full of particular significance. They named him Ezekiel Thomas Wells, the middle name for Ezekiel's lost brother in California, and watching Ezekiel hold his grandson with the expression of a man encountering a form of love he had not previously experienced was one of the finest things Susan had ever seen, and she had been watching him with admiration for 22 years. "He has your look," Ezekiel said, which was not quite accurate because the infant looked like all newborns, which is to say like a generalized baby rather than a specific person, but Susan understood what he meant and agreed. A second grandchild, a girl named Martha Susan Wells, followed in 1898, and the naming of her for Martha Crane was Susan's idea and Ezekiel's immediate and unconditional agreement. And when Susan told Clara the name, Clara said it was exactly right and had to spend a private moment in the kitchen before she came back to the conversation. The century turned, and the world that had been the Wild West of their young lives was not gone but transformed, settled into something more established and less raw. The open range era finished. The cattle drives from Texas, a thing of the past. Dodge City itself long quieted from its peak years into a proper town with schools and churches and a newspaper. The frontier had become the plains, and the plains were becoming the ordinary middle ground of American life, worked by the families who had come to it and made something out of it. The injustice of how that land had been taken from the people who had lived on it for generations before any of them arrived was a thing that the people of the time engaged with differently and with different degrees of acknowledgement. But Susan, who had spent her adult life building and maintaining and understanding what it meant to have a place of your own and what it meant to lose it, held this knowledge in the particular way of someone who cannot unknow what they have understood. Ezekiel, who had ridden through enough of the changing territory in the years when the changes were happening, and who had dealt with enough different kinds of people in enough different circumstances to have lost his assumptions about who deserved what, said nothing, that was not true when the subject came up, and refused to participate in the comfortable self-congratulation that many of the settlers around them offered. It was not a simple thing, and he did not pretend it was, and Susan loved him for that as for everything else. On a May morning in 1900, the 26th anniversary of the day they met on the Kansas Trail, Susan made biscuits for breakfast as she did every year, and she made them golden and risen, and served them with butter and honey at the long table where Ezekiel and James and Helen and little Ezekiel Thomas and baby Martha Susan were gathered. And Clara came in from the school before her morning class began and sat down for the occasion, because she understood what the occasion was. Ezekiel sat at the head of the table that he had built himself and looked at the faces around it, and then he looked at his wife, who was 50 years old and more beautiful to him in every specific way than she had been on any previous day, and he said what he said every year on this day, which had become the ritual of it. 26 years ago, he said, I found a woman on the Kansas Trail who was in a difficulty, and I gave her the only biscuit I had left. And she told me it was the kindest thing anyone had done for her in a long time. It was, Susan said, which was her part of the ritual. I have been trying to live up to it ever since, he said. You have succeeded, she said, in absolutely every way. James, who had heard this exchange every May of his adult life, looked at his son across the table and saw the boy watching his grandparents with the open, uncritical attention of a child who does not yet know how rare this kind of love is, and thought that perhaps not knowing was the best way to see it. Clara looked at the biscuits and then at her father and said, You know, you saved her life, giving her that water and that food and the company. You should say that part. She was saving her own life, Ezekiel said. I just made it easier. Susan looked at her husband across the breakfast table with 26 years of morning light between them, 26 springs and winters, and the full accumulated weight of a life built together from nothing but will and work and the kind of love that does not make speeches but shows itself in the dailiness of every single ordinary and extraordinary day, and she said, We made it easier, together. That is the whole story. And it was. Every word of it was true. The south porch still faced the direction it had always faced, and on spring evenings Susan and Ezekiel still sat there as they had from the first year, watching the light go off the Kansas plain in its particular way, the gold deepening to orange, and then to the particular dark blue that comes just before the stars, and the cottonwoods along the creek still made their dry, gentle sound in the evening wind, and the house behind them was warm and full of the sound of their people. And everything that had been built from a chance meeting on a trail in 1874, and a biscuit given without calculation, and received with the full understanding of what it meant stood solid and complete and entirely good in the May evening light. The wind moved through the grass the way it always had, restless and unhurried and carrying the smell of the prairie, and Susan leaned her head against her husband's shoulder, and he put his arm around her the way he had for more than 2 decades, with the easy, particular rightness of a gesture so thoroughly habitual that it had become as natural as breathing, and they watched the stars come out above the flat and endless Kansas plain, one by one, the way they always had and always would. And everything that mattered was exactly where it was supposed to be.